It started with headlights, too bright, too fast. Blazing down a deserted stretch of Highway 17 just outside Jacksonville, Florida, like a warning that had no intention of being subtle. Lieutenant Commander Nadia Fields didn't panic. She noticed. She adjusted. She kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel of her midnight blue Acura, eyes forward, heart steady. The road was slick with the remains of a summer storm, and the jazz murmuring through her speakers had been her only company for the last 40 miles. Until now. The red and blue strobes lit up her rear view like emergency fireworks. No siren, just a quick, sharp whoop. Enough to say, now, she was alone. 11 minutes past 11. No traffic, no witnesses. No cause, just a black woman in a luxury car heading home after visiting her mother. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't swerved. She hadn't even touched her phone. But she knew what this was. Not a traffic stop, not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. It was a ritual. One thing every Black American knows. One written in muscle memory and passed down like survival scripture. Pull over, turn off the engine, roll down the window halfway. Hands visible, eyes forward, mouth shut. Be small, be soft, be alive. She exhaled once, calm, cold. The patrol car pulled in behind her, lights still flashing. The door opened slowly. He stepped out. White male, late 30s, tall. Stocky, confident in that lazy, dangerous way, like someone who'd never been told no and didn't expect to hear it tonight. His name tag read, Sergeant B. Knox, but his walk said, I don't care who you are. I've already decided what you are. He approached with purpose, not urgency, not caution. Just that creeping entitlement. The kind that fills the gaps when the law forgets to enforce restraint. No greeting. No good evening. No, do you know why I pulled you over? Just license and registration. Nadia turned her head slowly, catching his reflection in the side mirror. Cool eyes, tense jaw. One hand on his belt, the other gripping a flashlight like it was a weapon, waiting for a reason. Her voice was low, even. Of course, officer. May I ask why I was stopped? He didn't answer. She reached, slowly, for the glove box. She pulled out her license, her registration, and her Department of Defense ID, though she left that last one half hidden behind the others. She wasn't playing that card yet. He took the documents from her, glancing down, then back up at her car. Taillights out, he said flatly. It wasn't. She knew it wasn't. She had replaced both just last month. Military precision didn't end at deployment. It extended to maintenance schedules and personal readiness. Still, she nodded. I wasn't aware, she said calmly. But I appreciate you letting me know. That should have been the end of it. A warning, maybe. A ticket, if he was feeling vindictive. Instead, step out of the vehicle. Her fingers tightened slightly on the wheel. Excuse me? Knox leaned in closer, voice still deadpan. Out. Now. No explanation, no probable cause, just power, raw, practiced, and unchallenged. She looked at him then, fully, and in that half-second, she understood exactly who he was. He didn't see a woman, he saw a threat, not because of her actions. Because of her existence, because of her skin, because of her poise. Because of the calm that didn't shrink beneath his authority. I'd like to understand the reason, she began. He cut her off. Because I said so. That was all he had, and in his world, it was enough. Nadia didn't argue. She reached for the door. opened it, stepped out slowly, carefully. The air was thick and humid. The cicadas had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She stood tall, shoulders square, eye level. No threat, no fear, just a woman refusing to disappear. Knox stepped back, scanning her like a blueprint. Turn around, hands on the hood. She didn't move. For what reason? His jaw tightened. The flashlight clicked off. Are you resisting? No. I'm asking. And just like that, it happened. He reached for his radio, muttering words meant to escalate. Non-compliant female, proceeding with detainment. Then louder, toward her. Turn around or you're under arrest. She didn't flinch. She'd heard worse from insurgents. She'd stared down foreign officers in war zones with sharper authority than his, and none of them ever scared her like this man with a badge in her own country did. But this time, he had picked the wrong woman. The cuffs went on tight. Deliberate. Vindictive, he shoved her toward the patrol car with a smirk. You don't know what you're doing, she murmured. He laughed. I know exactly what I'm doing. But he didn't, not even close. Because the woman now sitting in the back of his squad car, the one he just arrested without cause, she had friends in high places, clearance above his pay grade, and a courtroom waiting to burn his career to ash. He thought she was just another black woman he could threaten, until she walked into that courtroom and destroyed him. She stepped out slowly. No sudden movements. No dramatic flinch, just quiet, deliberate motion, like someone trained to assess a threat without provoking it. The pavement beneath her boots was still damp from the evening rain. A single streetlight flickered overhead, its glow casting long, ghostly shadows across the shoulder of Highway 17. Nadia Fields didn't look like a soldier, not tonight, no pressed uniform. No rank on display, no rows of ribbons stitched into fabric that demanded respect, just a black sweater. Slim-fit jeans, running shoes, but that didn't mean the soldier was gone. She carried it differently now, in her posture, her silence, her eyes. Sergeant Bradley Knox didn't see any of that. What he saw was a black woman. Alone, well-dressed, driving a car he didn't think she could afford. He mistook composure for arrogance, stillness for defiance. And like so many before him, he believed that if she wasn't wearing her authority on her sleeve, she had none to speak of. Turn around, hands on the hood, he said again, more clipped this time. Nadia didn't move immediately. She tilted her head just slightly, enough to catch his eyes without provoking them. For what reason, officer? It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even resistance. It was a question, a fair one, but in his mind, even asking made her insubordinate. Knox took a step forward, his boots scraping against gravel. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and gave her that look, the one that came from years of knowing the system would always choose him over her. The look of a man who had never been held accountable because no one had ever made it far enough to hold him. Are you resisting? He asked, voice low and full of warning. She didn't answer. Not yet, because part of her, the part that had sat through cultural briefings, that had led diversity training back at Mayport, that had spent nights awake in war zones waiting for things to go wrong, knew that no matter how calm she stayed, this could go sideways. Fast. But the other part, the one that had survived things men like him could never imagine, refused to give in. I'm asking a question, she replied gently. Her voice was level, even pleasant. That seemed to bother him more than a scream would have. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to decide whether she was stupid or dangerous. he settled on both. Without warning, Knox reached for his radio and spoke into it with mechanical detachment. "Dispatch, I've got a non-compliant female, requesting backup." Nadia exhaled through her nose, a slow, measured release of breath. Her pulse ticked up. Not from fear, but from preparation, because this wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. It was about every woman like her who had dared to ask a question and been punished for it. It was about every soldier who'd come home and realized that no matter how many tours they served, their skin still made them suspect. Knox raised a hand, motioning sharply. "Turn around, hands on the car, now." She gave him one last glance. Not pleading, not angry, just aware. And then, because she knew what came next, she turned, placed her hands gently on the hood, felt the cool metal kiss her palms. She didn't shake, she didn't flinch, but inside, something old and familiar began to awaken, the same steel that had carried her through battlefield briefings and hostage extractions. The part of her that calculated every angle of a room within seconds, the one that never blinked first. Behind her, she heard Knox unclip his cuffs. The metal clinked once, twice. Then came the sound of footsteps, purposeful, heavy. He grabbed her wrists, tight, too tight. Her shoulders shifted slightly at the pressure. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a fact. Knox chuckled, his voice just behind her ear. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't, not even close, because in his rush to assert dominance, he had overlooked the most dangerous kind of opponent, one who doesn't need to raise their voice. One who knows the system because she's defended it. One who has spent years learning to remain calm when men like him reach for control they haven't earned. He thought she was just another traffic stop. He thought she was just another woman too proud for her own good. He thought, and that was his mistake, because Nadia Fields wasn't thinking. She was calculating, and every second she remained silent, still and handcuffed, she was documenting, committing his face, his tone, his words to memory. Storing them not for revenge, but for justice, because men like Knox could only operate in darkness, and she was already turning on the lights. The cuffs bit in, tighter than they needed to be, deliberate. More a message than a restraint. Nadia Fields winced, but only slightly, just enough for the pain to register, not enough to give him the satisfaction. Sergeant Bradley Knox leaned in as he finished locking the second cuff. She could feel his breath, hot and close, could hear the little snort of satisfaction he didn't bother to hide. "You don't follow instructions very well," he muttered, as if her silence had been an act of defiance. Her voice, when it came, was low, even, unshaken. Asking why isn't the same as refusing. But Knox didn't believe that. Not with her, not with that skin, not with that calm, unbothered composure that so many men like him mistook for arrogance. He pulled her wrists back sharply, forcing her to step backward toward his squad car. The cuffs pressed deeper, metal grinding against bone. "You're under arrest," he said, with the smugness of someone who thought the words alone were enough to make it true. "For what?" she asked the question quietly. No sarcasm, no raised voice. Just clarity. It was the kind of question any citizen might ask when facing the possibility of being detained without cause. The kind of question the Constitution protects. But to Knox, questions were threats, because they implied awareness, intelligence, a refusal to be docile. "Obstruction," he snapped, tugging her toward the vehicle. She didn't resist. Didn't fight. But her spine remained straight, even as he opened the back door and gestured, "No!" Shoved her inside. The plastic seat was hard, unyielding. She shifted slightly, already feeling the sharp bite of the handcuffs cutting into the nerves of her wrists. The door slammed shut, and for a moment, she was alone again. Not in the quiet freedom of her own car, but in the cold, echoing silence of someone else's control. Outside, Knox radioed something in, his voice a mix of static and authority. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. She had heard enough of them over the years, shaped into reports, misfiled into excuses, buried under red tape and silence. This would not be one of those cases. She looked down at her hands, bound and aching, then out the side window, then into the dark reflection of her own face in the plastic divider. Her expression was unreadable, but behind her eyes, the memory of each second was setting like concrete. The flashlight. The question he didn't like. The lie about the tail light. The instant escalation when she asked, why? There were no witnesses. No cameras that she could see. But she had been trained for worse in places far more dangerous than Jacksonville's outskirts. She had survived ambushes in Basra, evacuated civilians from Kabul, held rank in boardrooms filled with men who questioned her qualifications before she even sat down. This was nothing new. What made it different was the badge and the silence. Because when a man with a badge decides he's threatened by your tone, your posture, your poise, even your patience becomes evidence against you. She sat in stillness, not because she had given up, but because she was watching. Listening, collecting. The squad car jolted forward, lurching back onto the highway. He didn't speak at first, just drove, quick and jerky, like the very act of controlling the wheel gave him reassurance. The red and blue lights still flashed above them, painting the road in strokes of false emergency. Then finally, he said it. "You people are all the same." She didn't respond, didn't blink. Knox glanced at her in the mirror. "Think you're above the law just because you can string a sentence together?" Still, she stayed silent, because in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't about a taillight. It wasn't about compliance. It wasn't even about her. It was about his need to prove something to himself, and she, quiet, black, composed, had become the target of that need. He needed her to be small, to beg, to justify her existence. But she wouldn't. Not then, not now, not ever. Outside the window, the highway gave way to city streets, dim storefronts, flickering neon signs, rows of houses still lit from within, unaware of the injustice passing quietly outside their doors. She knew what came next. The station. Processing. Fingerprint ink, camera flashes, and questions with answers that wouldn't matter. But even now, with her wrists burning and her dignity bruised, she knew this wasn't the end. It was the start of something else. Because men like Knox thrived in silence. But she was already planning what to say when the silence broke. The police cruiser smelled like dust and dried coffee. A faint tang of old vinyl and cigarette smoke clung to the back seat, mixing with the cold scent of regulation plastic and worn leather. The kind of smell that told a story, whether it was asked for or not. Nadia Fields sat still. Her wrists were locked behind her, pressed against the hard shell of the molded seat. The cuffs hadn't been loosened. That she already expected. Pain was never the surprise. It was the intent behind it that lingered longer. She didn't fidget. Didn't lean forward. Didn't beg. She watched the road through the darkened window, red and blue strobes pulsing across glass like a warning shot in slow motion. Her breathing was steady, her gaze still, but every nerve in her body was awake. She could feel the shift in energy from the front seat, could sense Sergeant Knox glancing at her through the mirror more often than necessary, like a man trying to solve a puzzle he didn't know he'd started. He shifted in his seat, adjusted the radio, whistled low, smug. At ease, but beneath that, tension. It was in the flex of his knuckles on the steering wheel, the way he cleared his throat for no reason. He wasn't used to silence, not this kind, not from someone he thought he had cornered. Finally, he spoke. "You know, most people just shut their mouths when I tell them to step out." He said it like a joke, but there was something behind it. A test. A jab in search of a bruise. Nadia didn't rise to the bait. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned her head, just enough for her eyes to meet his in the rear view. And with the kind of calm that can't be faked, she said, "Most officers don't arrest people for asking a question." It landed soft. Too soft, maybe, for a man like Knox to register as a threat. But that was the brilliance of it. Because her voice didn't have to be loud to be dangerous, it just had to be clear. He scoffed, forced a dry laugh. His fingers tapped the steering wheel like they needed something to do. "Lady," he muttered, "you must really think you're somebody." Again, she didn't respond. Because she didn't think, she knew, and that truth, the one she didn't need to announce, rattled him more than a courtroom full of lawyers ever could. He adjusted his mirror, avoiding her gaze now. For a moment, the only sound was the soft whine of tires on wet asphalt. Then his tone changed, sharper this time, edged with suspicion. "You military?" It wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. He was piecing it together, too late. Nadia didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her posture answered for her. "Yeah," he muttered to himself. "You've got that look. That don't mess with me look." He smirked again, but it was less confident this time. The swagger was cracking. "Bet you thought if you played the soldier card, I'd back off." Still silence, because his voice didn't matter. But hers was coming, soon. He tapped the dashboard, shifting in his seat again. The red glow of the dashboard reflected off the windshield like a warning flare neither of them could name. Knox exhaled sharply, then added almost bitterly, "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." That did it. That line, so familiar, so worn from overuse in situations where guilt is fabricated and blame is transferred, hung in the car like smoke. And Nadia, without raising her voice, without shifting her weight, let it settle. Then spoke. "I know exactly what I'm allowed to do." She paused. "And I know what you can't." The temperature in the cruiser dropped. Knox gripped the wheel a little tighter. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence was enough. Because beneath his uniform, beneath the badge and the entitlement and the years of going unchecked, a flicker of something finally lit behind his eyes. Doubt. It wasn't much. But it was there. That flicker of uncertainty that every bully feels when they realize the person they're trying to crush has more power than they expected, and worse, that they know how to use it. Nadia didn't smirk. Didn't gloat. She didn't need to, because the real power in that car wasn't coming from the front seat. It was radiating from the back, from the calm, cuffed woman who hadn't shouted once, but had already taken control of the narrative. And Sergeant Knox, for the first time, started to feel it. He didn't speak again for the rest of the drive. The station was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes with peace, but the thick, stale kind that clung to fluorescent lights and coffee-stained desks. It was the silence of bureaucracy in its most exhausted form. A few tired officers murmured behind plexiglass, their voices flat, their expressions carved from routine. Sergeant Knox walked in like he owned the place, because until now, he always had. "Got one for processing," he called out, dragging the door open with a thud, and guiding Nadia Fields forward with a hand that was more push than escort. The desk sergeant barely looked up. "Female." "Obstruction," Knox added. "Possible non-compliance. We'll file formal charges later." Nadia said nothing. Her wrists were still cuffed, too tight. Her shoulders ached. She could feel the metal pressing into bone, but she didn't grimace. Not in front of them. She walked calmly, head high, through the familiar indignities. Fingerprints. Mugshot. No questions, just forms. The indignation wasn't in what they did. It was in how little they cared while doing it. The apathy behind the clicking keyboard, the indifference behind the lens. The officers didn't look at her as a person, but as a task, a delay, a name they wouldn't remember by lunch. To them, she was processed property. And Sergeant Knox? He was enjoying every second of it. But not for long. The holding area was small, one row of steel benches, a gray wall lined with locked cell doors, and a flickering bulb that cast everyone in a sickly hue. Knox uncuffed her, only to shove her forward. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered. Nadia glanced sideways. "I don't have to think." The steel door clanked shut behind her. Inside, the cell was bare. A bench, a toilet, and 4 walls that had seen too many stories like hers end without a sound. She sat down quietly, pressing her palms against her knees to ground herself. She had spent nights in worse places. She had slept beside gunfire. This was a different battlefield, but the tactics were familiar. Wait. Observe. Endure. Strike only when it matters. Outside the bars, Knox stood with his arms folded, gloating silently. Until... "Sergeant Knox?" The voice came from the hallway. A younger officer, clean-shaven, early 20s, with a clipboard in hand and hesitation in his step. His badge was new enough to still shine under the ceiling lights. Knox turned, irritated. "What?" The younger man hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the cell where Nadia sat. He cleared his throat and held the clipboard tighter. "There's been, a call." Knox raised an eyebrow. "So?" "It's from, Defense Command. Joint Base Charleston. They said, well, they asked about the woman you just brought in." Knox narrowed his eyes. "Defense Command?" The young officer nodded, clearly nervous. "Yes, sir. They asked if Lieutenant Commander Nadia Fields was being held here." Lieutenant Commander. The title hung in the air like a slow explosion, silent but deadly. Knox blinked. He hadn't heard it wrong. The words were clear. And suddenly, so was the mistake. He looked toward the cell. Nadia didn't look back. She just sat, hands folded in her lap, the very picture of patience and power, waiting for gravity to do its work. Knox's face twitched. He stepped closer to the younger officer, his voice low. "Who took the call?" "The duty captain. Said they'd be following up. There's a colonel trying to reach the precinct commander now." Silence stretched. Knox didn't move. Then, slowly, like someone realizing the earth was shifting beneath his feet, he turned to look at her again. She finally raised her eyes. Calm, steady, piercing. She didn't smirk. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, he knew. He had arrested the wrong woman. Not just a black woman with a nice car. Not just someone mouthy who didn't know her place, but a high-ranking Navy officer, a decorated veteran. Someone with access, clearance, and connections strong enough to send shockwaves through an entire chain of command. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not the smug silence of power, but the crushing silence of consequence. Knox's jaw clenched, his shoulders squared, trying to salvage dignity that was already leaking from his pores. He turned sharply, muttering under his breath, and stormed down the hallway. The younger officer remained frozen for a second, then glanced at Nadia through the bars, eyes wide with realization. She gave him a single nod. Then it returned to stillness. Because this wasn't over, it was just beginning. The courtroom air was chilled, crisp in a way that felt designed to suppress emotion. But it couldn't. Not today. Inside the Duval County Courthouse, the room was packed. Officers, reporters, legal clerks. Members of the public who had caught wind of the story, all of them gathered under the weight of something unspoken, something electric. A reckoning that had taken its time but was now impossible to ignore. At the defense table sat Lieutenant Commander Nadia Fields, no longer in cuffs, no longer silent. She wore a navy blazer, understated but sharp, and beneath it, a white blouse pressed to perfection. No medals. No insignia, just presence, quiet, grounded, and unmistakably in control. Beside her, attorney Carla Whitman flipped through a thick stack of files with clinical efficiency. Her lips moved in a whisper, eyes flicking up every few seconds to gauge the room. At the opposite table, Sergeant Bradley Knox sat rigid, jaw tight, arms crossed. He still wore his uniform, but it no longer commanded the same respect. His posture was stiffer now, his confidence chipped, his authority under scrutiny. Judge Eldon Mercer, an older man with gray temples and a courtroom reputation for sharp fairness, adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the file in front of him. The hearing began without fanfare. Just facts, just procedure, but the tension was loud. The prosecutor stood first, his voice measured, but clear. Your Honor, we contend that the arrest of Lieutenant Commander Fields was not only unjustified, but a clear abuse of discretion under color of authority. A murmur rolled through the courtroom. The judge raised a hand. Quiet, please. The prosecutor continued, tapping the evidence folder. We will demonstrate that no probable cause was established, no crime committed, and that the escalation was driven not by policy, but by personal bias. He turned toward the courtroom screen. And to support that, we'd like to introduce body cam footage submitted by the Jacksonville Police Department taken from the night in question. Judge Mercer gave a single nod. Play it. The lights dimmed. The video began. At first static, then the unmistakable sound of heavy boots on asphalt. The footage showed Knox approaching the driver's side of Nadia's Acura. His voice, sharp and clipped, license and registration. No greeting, no context. Nadia's calm voice followed. Was I speeding, officer? Knox. Tail lights out. Then came the silence. That uncomfortable moment when the audience realized this wasn't procedure, this was performance. A slow, methodical attempt to assert control where none had been earned. The footage rolled on. Knox's tone sharpened. The command, step out of the vehicle. Nadia's question, mind telling me why? Then the escalation. His voice rising, the cuffs, her compliance. And the final line, clear as a bell, you're under arrest for obstructing. Gasps scattered across the courtroom. The judge didn't react, but his eyes didn't leave the screen. Then the sound of the patrol car, Knox laughing, sneering. Her voice again, low, measured. "I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know what you can't." The footage ended. Silence fell like a stone. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Judge Mercer took a breath, removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Then, slowly, he looked at Knox. "Sergeant," he began, his voice heavier than before, "you submitted a report indicating the arrest was made due to aggressive behavior and failure to comply." Knox nodded stiffly. The judge tapped the folder in front of him. "That report makes no mention of the tone, of the absence of a traffic violation, of your refusal to offer a reason for the stop. It also omits your commentary while transporting the defendant, commentary that, I'll be blunt, reflects personal animus rather than professional conduct." Knox said nothing. The judge continued, "In addition, internal records show that over 70% of your traffic stops in the last 2 years have involved black drivers, disproportionate to the demographic makeup of your patrol district." The room tightened. The judge looked over his glasses now, his tone cooling. "That's a pattern, Sergeant, and in this court, patterns matter." He turned toward Nadia. "Lieutenant Commander Fields, this court acknowledges your service, your conduct, and your restraint. You were calm, professional, and respectful in the face of unlawful treatment. That is more than I can say for the officer who arrested you." Nadia didn't smile. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. The truth had finally entered the record. Judge Mercer leaned back. "It is the judgment of this court that the arrest was unlawful. The charges are hereby dismissed with prejudice." He paused, letting it land. "And further, I am formally recommending an internal investigation into Sergeant Knox's conduct, including, but not limited to, racial profiling, abuse of authority, and false reporting." His gavel came down. Once. Sharp. Final. The courtroom exhaled. Reporters scribbled. Officers shifted. Knox sat frozen, his world rearranged in the span of a few minutes. But Nadia, she simply gathered her things, stood, straightened her jacket, and walked out. Not because she had to, but now the system was being forced to follow her. The hallway outside courtroom 3B no longer belonged to Sergeant Bradley Knox. Not today, not with the cameras rolling, not with court officers whispering just loud enough for others to hear. Not with every step echoing against polished tile like a countdown. He moved quickly, head down, face flushed. Not from shame, not yet, but from something far more dangerous for a man like him. Recognition. People knew. Not who he was. That had never mattered, but what he had done. And now, for the first time in his career, there were eyes watching. Eyes that wouldn't look away this time. He reached the end of the hallway, pushed through the double doors, and nearly collided with Chief Raymond Ellis. Ellis didn't flinch. Didn't smile, didn't offer a nod of respect. He simply said, "Follow me." The door to the administrative office closed with a sharp click, and Knox stood at attention out of habit. Old instincts told him to square his shoulders, raise his chin, and hide the storm swelling behind his eyes. But Ellis wasn't looking at posture. He was looking at the truth. And he held it in a manila folder stamped with the department seal. "What the hell were you thinking?" the chief asked, voice low, grave. Not angry yet, but something colder. Knox exhaled. "Sir, I was just doing my job." Ellis's jaw tightened. He threw the folder between them down on the desk. It landed with a thud, heavy with implication. "No, you weren't," the chief said. "You were doing what you've always done, but this time you picked the wrong woman. And the whole damn country is watching." Knox's mouth opened, but no words came out. Ellis leaned forward. "You didn't even know who she was, did you?" No warrant, No cause, just a suspicious tail light and a gut feeling. His voice twisted on the last phrase, gut feeling, like he was spitting out something rotten. Knox tried to shift the blame. She was argumentative, sir. I've dealt with... Stop. The word cracked the room like a gunshot. You don't get to define resistance anymore, not when it's coming from someone asking a basic question. Ellis opened the folder and began reading aloud. 72% of your traffic stops involve black drivers. 41% resulted in escalated force. Less than 8% involved verifiable violations. He didn't look up. Do you know what that tells me? Knox said nothing. Ellis answered for him. It tells me we have a racism problem wearing a badge, and we let it grow for 5 years. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with history, with names, with records, with the faces of men and women who didn't have the rank, the clearance, or the courtroom to fight back. It was the silence of the system, realizing it could no longer look away. Ellis sat down behind the desk. His eyes never left Knox's face. You're being suspended. Effective immediately, Internal Affairs is reopening every single arrest you've made in the last 5 years. Knox clenched his fists. This is political, he muttered. Just because she... It's not political, Ellis cut in. It's overdue. He slid a form across the table. You'll sign this. You'll surrender your badge and weapon, and if I were you, I'd call a lawyer, because if the trend in this file holds true, and I believe it will, you're not just looking at disciplinary action. Knox stared at the form. For the first time, his hands trembled. He had spent a career hiding behind the shield of silence, patrol logs that no one questioned, reports filled with subtle omissions, a tone of voice that changed based on who was standing in front of him. But today, the shield cracked. Today, there were repercussions, and worst of all, he realized something else, something colder than suspension or exposure. His power had never been real. It wasn't rooted in law, or integrity, or merit. It had existed because the system let it, because no one had challenged it, until now. Until she did. Knox finally looked up. What if they dig through everything? He asked, voice barely a whisper. Ellis's face hardened. They already are. And then, with a sigh that came from somewhere deep beneath years of buried regret, the chief added, "And I'm not stopping them." Knox sat back, ashen. No words. No defense. Just the dull, echoing sound of consequences finally catching up. Across town, Nadia Fields sat in a quiet cafe, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. She wasn't celebrating, she wasn't gloating, but she was watching. Because the machine that had failed so many had finally blinked. It had finally said, enough. Not for her, but for what she represented. And someone, somewhere, had listened. The spoon clinked gently against the inside of the ceramic mug. Once, twice, then stillness. Lieutenant Commander Nadia Fields stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, the soft swirl of steam rising in front of her like a quiet exhale. Outside the window, the afternoon light slipped between downtown buildings in warm shafts, casting golden streaks across the cafe floor. The place was half full, an older couple reading the newspaper, a teenager hunched over homework, a few city workers grabbing late lunches in fluorescent vests. No one knew her name. No one recognized her face. No one whispered or pointed. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Nadia's phone rested screen down beside her saucer, but she didn't need to look at it. She had already read everything. The notifications had come in like a drumbeat. Department of Defense responds to wrongful arrest. Mayor Grant condemns systemic bias in uniform. Sergeant suspended pending full investigation. Lieutenant Commander Nadia Fields speaks through actions, not words. They called it bravery, composure, a masterclass in restraint. But to Nadia, it was none of that. It was simply necessary. She took a sip, lukewarm now, and let the bitterness settle on her tongue. Her eyes wandered to a mother walking past the cafe window holding her son's hand. He laughed at something she said, his small sneakers tapping wildly against the pavement. That sound, unguarded joy, brought a faint curve to Nadia's lips, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for attention, the kind that lives between memories and conviction. Across from her on the table, a folded copy of the Florida Sentinel lay untouched, its headline bold and unapologetic. When authority abuses, silence is not an option. And just beneath it, her name, spelled correctly for once. But Nadia didn't care about headlines. She had never needed the spotlight to feel powerful. She knew what she carried inside, the weight of command, the scars of service, and the echo of all the voices that had been silenced before her. Today, she had spoken for them, not with a microphone, but with restraint, with posture, with dignity. With a calm refusal to break, even as a man in uniform tried to erase her with zip ties and a smirk. They would write about how poised she was, how brave, how professional. But what they wouldn't see, what they'd miss entirely, was the tremble beneath the stillness, the pressure behind every breath she had to measure in that squad car, in that holding cell, in that courtroom. It wasn't about professionalism, it was about survival. And she knew, not everyone made it out. Nadia's hand hovered above the cup for a moment. Her fingers traced the rim as if it were the edge of something much bigger. A threshold, a promise. The cafe door opened. A gust of cooler air swept through. Conversations paused for a second, then resumed. Just like the world, because the world doesn't stop for injustice, it just shifts, slowly, reluctantly, and only when forced. Her phone buzzed once. A new message from her commanding officer. The Pentagon is aware. Don't be surprised if they reach out. Another ping. From the mayor's office, requesting a public statement, opportunity to speak for reform. She didn't reply to either, not yet. Because this moment, this quiet, belonged to her. And more importantly, it belonged to the people who couldn't take it for themselves. The single mother who couldn't afford to fight a bogus charge. The teenage boy was cuffed to a curb because of a hoodie. The veteran was mistaken for a threat instead of a patriot. The dozens, hundreds, whose names never made headlines. She carried them all with her, in the way she walked, in the way she answered. In the way she didn't scream even when it burned in her throat to do so. She didn't want to be a symbol, but the system had made her one. And now that spotlight, the one meant to blind her, was shining backwards, into the cracks, into the rot, into the uniforms, hiding cruelty behind protocol. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was the strategy. A measured refusal to meet aggression with noise, a quiet demand for accountability spoken in the language that power understands best, presence. Because when you've been denied your humanity, sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stand still. A shadow passed over her table as a news van rolled by. Another camera crew, another frame to be filled with her image. She didn't turn to look. She stirred her coffee one last time, then set the spoon down with care. And finally, she whispered to herself, not for the press, not for the public, but for every voice that had gone unheard. This wasn't just about me. And it never had been. The sun had started to set behind the skyline, casting long shadows that stretched across the concrete like reaching hands. Downtown Jacksonville hummed with its usual rhythm, cars rolling through intersections, pigeons scattering near bus stops, the occasional siren in the distance. But in this moment, it all felt quieter, slower, more deliberate. Lieutenant Commander Nadia Fields walked with her hands free, her stride measured, and her head held high, not in defiance, but in truth. She passed storefronts, street vendors, and office workers stepping out for fresh air. And though most didn't know her name, some did. A few glanced twice. One older woman mouthed something softly as she passed. "Thank you." Nadia didn't stop. Didn't smile. Just nodded gently, a motion so small it could be missed, but filled with weight. Not long ago, she'd been walked through a similar space with her wrists cuffed, her rights dismissed, and her presence reduced to suspicion. Now, every step felt like a correction, not of history, but of perception. A rewriting in real time of what authority should look like, who deserves respect, and what happens when silence becomes a weapon, not a weakness. Later that evening, at a modest community gathering space just off Main Street, chairs had been arranged in a semicircle. No stage, no microphone. Just people, activists, veterans, teachers, parents. A few journalists sat near the back, notebooks ready, but unsure whether this would become a speech or something else entirely. Nadia stood at the front in a simple blouse and slacks. No uniform, no insignia. Just the truth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I was never supposed to be in handcuffs," she began, "but I was." A pause. "And I was never supposed to have to explain my humanity, but I did." The room leaned in, not because of volume, but because of gravity. She looked around, locking eyes with a young woman in the front row, a teenager with braids and quiet fire in her gaze. "This fight," Nadia said, "was never just mine." Her voice, though soft, struck like thunder. "It's for every black woman told to lower her gaze, to keep quiet, to be respectful while being humiliated, to obey, even when what she's obeying is injustice." A low murmur moved through the group. Not outrage. Not applause. Understanding. Nadia stepped forward, tone steady. "I didn't stand still in that courtroom so they'd call me a hero. I did it because I was tired of watching us be criminalized for being calm, for being confident, for being correct." She took a breath. The kind you take before saying something that will live long after it leaves your mouth. This wasn't just an incident. It was a reflection of a system that still cannot tell the difference between authority and control, between policing and intimidation, between presence and threat. She turned slightly toward the media in the back. "I want to be clear," she said. "This is not about one bad officer. It's about the structure that allowed him to thrive." One of the reporters raised a hand. "Lieutenant Commander Fields, do you see yourself as a symbol now, a face of reform?" Nadia tilted her head slightly. "No," she said. "I see myself as proof." A pause. "That the system can be challenged, that you don't have to shout to be heard. That dignity is louder than a badge when the badge is wrong." She nodded once, more to herself than anyone else. "And that we're done whispering." Outside, night had fallen. The city continued to breathe, uneven, imperfect, alive. Nadia stepped out into it and paused at the curb. A breeze swept past, carrying the distant sound of laughter from a nearby playground. Children chasing nothing in particular, free in a way adults forget how to be. She smiled, not because she had won, but because she had refused to lose. And now, she was more than a name in a headline. She was a mirror, reflecting every black woman who had been told she was too loud, too strong, too much, and everyone who had been punished simply for standing tall. Her phone buzzed again. Another request, another comment. Another story. She ignored it. Because in that moment, all she cared about was the ground beneath her feet, and the fact that this time she was walking it on her terms. This story wasn't just about an arrest, it was about power and who gets to keep it. About silence, not as surrender, but as strategy, and a woman who turned a single moment of injustice into a message heard across the nation. If you've ever been told to stay quiet, don't. If you've ever felt invisible, stand up. Because real change doesn't come from silence. It comes from the ones who dare to break it. Subscribe to Injustice Unmasked, where the truth gets a voice. Share this story. Someone needs to see it.